Hey, my name's Evan. Um, I wanted to start a series where I read some of the books that I have written. I've completed 3 books, and I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get published, but I still wanted to share them with the world. Um, my stories, they have a focus on, people of color, and this first book that I want to read, it's called Threefold Strangers. And, we're going to dive right in and hopefully you'll follow along. I'm going to read, a part a day until I finish it. And then hopefully I'll get through all 3 of my books. So, as I said, this is the first book that I finished. Took me about 10 years, but um, we're going to start with the epigraph and then we're going to go from there. All right. Uh, Comment or leave your opinions however you want to do, and we'll see how things go. All right. A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but 2 can stand back to back and conquer. 3 are even better, for a threefold cord is not easily broken. Ecclesiastes 4:12. And so it begins. Wanderer, Part 1. Hugo woke up to yelling. He heard the innkeeper's voice come through his open window, even though he was on the 2nd floor of his inn. He went to the window to find out what had happened. He didn't see anyone, but he heard the innkeeper when he started yelling. "Lako! My son! Somebody!" No sooner those words came from his mouth, Hugo watched someone run into the alley. This stranger ran through the alley and underneath his window, drops of blood trailing him. Hugo reasoned he was the killer. Remembering Lako, the innkeeper's son, remembering his inquisitiveness and what he had done for him, Hugo jumped from the window. Hugo versus Stranger. Hugo landed on a pillar he raised from the ground. With a short descent of the pillar, he brought himself to ground level before he chased after the stranger. He used his geo-energy, and he planned to use it to stop this killer. He manipulated the earth again, this time sending rope-like restraints after him, but the stranger eluded him by leaping on top of a tall wooden fence. The stranger eluded him using his arrow energy. Hugo stopped when the stranger turned to face him. He saw a man covered in black and gray, everything about him hidden except for his dark brown eyes and the blood stains. They stood and watched each other in silence. Hugo wondered why he killed Lako and why he wasn't trying to escape. He had to restrain him quickly in case he was stronger. He wished he knew the extent of his opponent's abilities, but lack of information didn't deter him. He was prepared to fight and apprehend this culprit. He manipulated the earth around him to send more rope-like restraints after him. He watched him evade them by flipping backward from the fence. Hugo raised pillars from the ground and climbed them to follow him, but when he reached his last pillar, his opponent was waiting. A squall sent him back through the air. He hit the ground hard. He rubbed his lower back, thinking he should have anticipated some kind of attack. He knew he had to be careful, especially against the arrow energist. Anyone facing an arrow energist had to be cautious. If skilled, they could easily suffocate their opponents from a distance. He kept his mind as he climbed the pillars again and flipped across the fence, landing across from his opponent. Before the culprit could attack him again, Hugo had taken action. While flipping, he had drawn restraints from the ground and used them to restrict the stranger's legs and arms. He brought him to his knees and further restrained him by drawing earth around his body up to his neck. He watched him rest his eyes on him. He caught his gaze. He found it familiar. Suddenly, he couldn't catch his breath. "You let your guard down," the stranger said. In a situation like this, that can be a fatal mistake. Hugo fell to his knees as he tried to breathe. He struggled, with one hand at his throat and the other clutching at the ground. The moment he caught his breath, he coughed, right before another squall sent him into a nearby wall. He watched the stranger use air to blow apart his restraints before he closed the distance between them. He felt dizzy and coughed as he breathed but got on his feet. They stood across from each other. He remembered that gaze from somewhere. It made him feel uncomfortable, ashamed, as if he had disappointed someone. It always had. This couldn't be his gaze, though. This couldn't be him. Hugo realized this man was more experienced than he was, but he felt for the victim. He remembered Lako, who he met a few hours ago, and his father, who hadn't mistreated him like others before them. They had treated him with respect, like a person. He couldn't let this man escape. He told himself he'd have to fight hard and use his head if he hoped to beat him. First, he would set him up. He clenched his fist and took his fighting stance. He kicked at him, but the stranger grabbed him by his leg and sent him flying upward with a squall channeled from his hand. Expecting this maneuver, Hugo watched him from above for a moment before he contained the stranger's whole body with earth from the ground and stones from nearby buildings. A chunk of earth from the ground served as his landing platform. He landed on it and set the platform down. Hugo watched the stranger free himself a second time, sending debris flying everywhere. He stopped the debris in midair and dropped it to the ground. This stranger's counter was familiar to him. He heard the voices of the townspeople nearing their location and figured when they arrived they'd assist him. Their voices kept him from speaking the name on his mind. "You could defeat me if you stopped trying to detain me," the stranger said. "But that doesn't matter to you. You want to know if I killed him. I didn't. I know who did, but you aren't strong enough to defeat him. You can't go after him yet." He listened to the stranger's words, but they left him puzzled. His voice sounded familiar too. "Who are you?" he asked, even though he meant to ask, "What do you mean? Do I know you? Do you know me?" He might know him, but he didn't think it was possible. The stranger pulled apart his facial mask. "Recognize me?" "Jackson." A huge grin spread across Hugo's face. He took a few steps forward to give his brother a hug, but he stopped himself. "You're here. What are you doing here?" His grin faded. "Lako, if you killed him..." He was sure the expression on his face read serious, with a mix of concern as he watched Jackson. He refused to believe his brother had become a murderer. "The reason I'm here is to protect you," Jackson said. He didn't know if he should believe him. He hadn't seen him in 4, almost 5 years. People change, and Jackson had tried to suffocate him minutes ago. "Protect me from who?" he asked him, uncertain whether he could trust the man who answered to his brother's name, but looked and acted nothing like the brother he used to know. "I'd explain the situation to you, but we don't have time. He's nearby, and I have to keep you safe." They both turned toward the townspeople's voices when they heard them growing louder and nearer. "You've been gone for 5 years. I find you, actually you find me, and you say you're here to protect me after you tried to suffocate me. A young man is dead, and you're covered in his blood. I've got questions, and to get some answers, I can't let you go." "I've proven you can't do what's necessary to stop me, or won't," Jackson said. Had he hesitated during this encounter because on some level he had known this was Jackson? Did Jackson know he held back during this encounter because he still wouldn't hurt someone if he could help it, even a murderer. "None of this looks good," Jackson told him. "I know. But if you trust me, if you remember that as your older brother, I would never steer you wrong, you'll know that the answers will come, and I'll explain everything. When you get out of prison, come find me in Lunaria. You'll get your answers there. Save Akura." "Prison?" Jackson's words puzzled him. "Who's Akira?" Suddenly, he couldn't catch his breath. Jackson watched Hugo try to breathe until he drew closer and knocked him unconscious. After he checked his breathing, he picked him up and rested him against a nearby building with air, using his arrow energy. He pulled up his sleeve, took his knife from his side, and proceeded to cut his arm, letting his blood fall on him. He cleaned his knife and returned it to his side before he covered his face. For a moment, he watched him breathe. After noticing a fire's glow headed toward them through the tall wooden fence, he leapt on top of the building and left Hugo to the townspeople. Well, you all, that was part 1 of Threefold Strangers. Tomorrow I will read part 2, and if you're interested, you'll get to learn more about Hugo's story. Thanks for listening. Hope you come back and tell your friends. All right, talk to you later. Bye.